You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you as always, Prashant. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. And for our listeners, we're going to take a little bit of a step back from the more granular conversations about specific topics that we have in Asia and reflect on the fundamental currency of geopolitics in Asia, which is power. So the Lowy Institute, an Australia-based think tank, just recently, just this week, released a very interesting new product that you can go check out on their website. It's called the Asia Power Index, and effectively what they've tried to do is create a one-stop portal that allows you to compare the relative power and the absolute power of 25 Asian countries. Now, this is an interesting project. As far as I know, this is the most granular attempt to do this in the public domain. Certainly, there have been previous attempts in less friendly ways, in kind of academic textual ways, but this is a very interactive tool. And what they've done is they've broken measures of power across these 25 Asian countries into 8 fundamental measures. These include economic resources of a country, the military capabilities, resilience, which means the ability to withstand shocks, future trends in the countries, their diplomatic influence, their economic relationships, defense networks, and their cultural influence. And across these 8 measures, there are 114 indicators. So this is quite granular. And effectively, these countries have been ranked along each of these measures. And there's some interesting findings. So I'll just go over quickly the top level findings, and then Prashant, we can get into some of the more interesting findings in the report. So no surprise, but the United States continues to remain the preeminent power in Asia. America, for all intents and purposes, is an Asian power, and the Lowy Index finds that the U.S. is still the top dog in the game, despite a rising China. But speaking of China, China is the emerging superpower in Asia, and it's rapidly closing in on the United States. So far, so good. That's mostly conventional wisdom there. Now, secondly, both Japan and India are classified as major powers, a rung below China and the United States here. And they're both on separate trajectories. Japan is declining along many measures, but India is quite clearly rising and is described here as a giant of the future in Asia. Now, the Lowy report here alleges that North Korea, Russia, and Taiwan are so-called misfit middle powers in Asia. And we can talk a bit about each of those countries and how they sort of come out in a lot of these rankings. And then finally, Singapore, Australia, and South Korea are notable overperformers in the Asian region. So they have this very interesting ranking here, looking at countries that punch above their weight and punch far below their weight. So Prashant, I'm going to turn it over to you now. What's your general impression of the way they decided to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you framed it is exactly right, which is that if you look at some of the main observations and conclusions that came out of it, such as, they classify the United States and China as superpowers, Japan and India as major powers, and the actual measures themselves are not entirely surprising. I think most folks would agree with that. The strengths of the index lie in the things that you emphasized, the granularity of it. I think they have 114 sub-indicators and 8 measures of power. And they not only look at capabilities, but they also divide it accordingly by resources and influence. So I think that's key, because what they're doing essentially is saying, it's not only important what countries have, it's also how they use that. And I thought the sort of underachiever, overachiever sort of categorization was quite useful in terms of figuring out, which countries are doing more with less, and which countries are unfortunately not able to do that. So I think those are the chief strengths of the index. I would say, one other thing that I would sort of emphasize is the fact that you pointed this out too. I mean, this is an interactive tool, and I think that's relative to some of the other categorizations where you have measures of power, but it's something which it's collated and collected by an organization, and you just sort of consume it. Here, they're quite transparent about the fact that in the index, they're weighting several of these different measures one way, but you can actually go into the tool and you can adjust the different measures and see whether you might have a different take on it. For example, you might think economic resources or military power matter much more significantly than cultural influence. Well, you can go in there and measure it and see how these countries sort of evolve in terms of their power and capabilities. So
Hmm.
I think those are the chief strengths of the index. I think one of the other things that, maybe we can get into a bit of a discussion about is, the initial reactions from these countries have been really interesting.
Yeah.
And from the Southeast Asian perspective, for example, the Indonesians were, pretty. It got a lot of headlines in Indonesia saying that, oh, Singapore and Malaysia are much more powerful or capable than us according to this index, where, most folks would think, oh, Indonesia is automatically the country that's the most capable. Well, that has to do with how they're measuring power across these various indicators. And I think similar reaction in Pakistan, where Pakistan was characterized as an underachiever, that certainly got a lot of headlines in the media. But I guess we should talk about some of these major actors too. And you attended the launch event and you asked about Japan as a major example. That's kind of another interesting example. So maybe we can talk about the other sort of major powers and superpower examples too.
Yeah, I mean, Japan is the big overachiever per this index, and
Hmm.
I should also say that when we're talking about what power means in the context of this index, I really like that they take a very holistic approach here. It's not a international relations realist take on power as the
Hmm.
balance of kind of military capabilities and who would triumph in a military conflict. It's a far broader, more holistic take. Japan's ranking as an overachiever really struck me because I was in Tokyo a few months ago talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, the future of Asian order. And in Tokyo, I mean, there is a real sense of fatalism among, bureaucrats and strategists. They recognize the country's demographic challenge, which is one of the sources of absolute decline in Japan. Japan will have a significantly smaller population by 2050. And, they're trying to figure out how they can stay atop their game as one of Asia's preeminent major powers. But
Hmm.
this index really, I think projects at least now, coming up on 2020, a still a very favorable position for Japan. I mean, given how much of an overachiever Japan is today, it would have to fall quite a bit to get to the point where it was actually punching below its weight. And I think this is to the credit of really, two generations of Japanese leadership at least. Japan, for instance, despite its hamstrung, offensive military. Japan still has a very capable military, but it's been thinking creatively and asymmetrically about how to leverage economic power. For instance, we all talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative today, but we forget that Japan really wrote the book on using overseas assistance
Hmm.
for geopolitical ends and ways to build influence. I mean, even if you look at a country like the Philippines, where Japanese investment is actually 20 times greater than Chinese investment. Yet all the headlines these days talk about how Duterte is being pulled into China's orbit. So Japan really does is kind of the quiet overperformer. I think this index reflects that well. So before I pass it back to you, one other thing that really struck out to me that comes out in this Asia Power Index ranking is that nuclear weapons do not pay.
Hmm.
That every country that possesses nuclear weapons in Asia is ranked an underachiever, which I thought was fascinating. So Russia and North Korea are the particular underachievers, which is, I think, fascinating in itself, given that Russia is a nuclear superpower, has literally thousands of nuclear warheads. And North Korea, obviously, we all know how they've been investing in nuclear capabilities as well. But also China, Pakistan, and India, all underachievers on the military front. And, conversely, it really seems like economic might really pays off. I mean, Singapore, Australia, South Korea, even Malaysia and Thailand. Those latter two you wouldn't commonly maybe think of as overachieving powers in Asia, but really, the story being told here is that raw military power, raw investment in both conventional and nuclear capabilities is not what really makes a 21st century power. There is a lot more to that, and we can debate obviously the value of that because assuming that the regional security architecture completely breaks down, the liberal international order, so-called liberal international order, completely evaporates, and we return to a sort of Hobbesian world of each country relying on a logic of self-help, then obviously I think the calculus changes, and whoever's got the most guns will come out on top. But certainly, given the the economic and political order that exists today in Asia, I think this index reflects quite well that there's more to power than just military capabilities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the point you made about Japan is particularly important because I think if you zoom out and sort of from that realist perspective that you mentioned, you just look at capabilities, you might see, out 30, 40 years, Japan as a declining power. But it's also true that the Japanese have, more experience than most powers in terms of, doing more with less. I mean, they've had to adjust to the various constraints that you mentioned. And so if there's any country that's able to handle that dynamic going forward, it's going to be Japan. And I think the other key factor here that I found really interesting was, I mean, there is a separate categorization for defense networks. And Japan and the United States fare quite strongly there. And China doesn't fare too well. Although I guess this kind of gets to one of the issues with the index, right? So the defense networks, the way that they're characterized in the report, is that they're mostly formal defense networks. And I think if you were to ask the Chinese and kind of push them to sort of elaborate, they would say that, well, we don't have formal alliances and partnerships, but we're actually, we have these things called, strategic partnerships or comprehensive strategic partnerships, which actually reflect some of these dynamics because we think that these alliances are, Cold War relics. So I think there are some definitional issues there. It's similar with this. There's a measure for future trends, right? And what's included in that basket of future trends, I suspect, may be different over time, which gets to I think another value of this Asia Power Index, which the authors have tried to emphasize, for all the contemporary conversation about who's ranking more and, it's sort of a measuring contest. The real value of this is, I mean, if you keep doing this index over time, for the next, 4, 5, 6 years, this could really be a continuous part of the conversation as Asia evolves, right?
Right.
And that's a conversation that's not only about capability, but as you noted, it's about intentions, it's about will, and it's about the broader geopolitical context that's evolving, including right before our eyes with the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the categories that really jumps out to me is the future trends category.
Hmm.
China scores incredibly well. So this is scored out of 100 for listeners that aren't looking at the report right now. But China gets an 83 out of 100. The United States gets a 60 out of 100, decent performance. India gets 55, and it's a precipitous drop from there. So apart from China, the United States, and India, really every other country in Asia, beginning with Indonesia downwards, Indonesia starts at 11.7 out of 100, and then it
Hmm.
just kind of falls off. So really, I mean, the future prospects for every other country appear to be quite negative. And maybe I'd quibble with some of the rankings there for some of the populous Southeast Asian countries, for instance. But
Yeah.
really, I think it tells you about these maybe quasi-balancing coalitions that we hear about, be it the Principled Security Network or the Quadrilateral Initiative, and all the concern about China. If you look at this index and you take some of these quantifications of Chinese power, and then across categories, you combine sort of Japan, India, Australia, and the United States into a category, and you sort of start to recognize, why this logic of balancing is so alluring to these powers. I mean, even if you just look at the overall power ranking, it's actually quite striking that India and Japan are almost neck and neck when it comes to their power ranking. And you put the two of them together, they basically come up to what the United States is rated for, and just that's just a hair above where China is today. So it is
Yep.
interesting that these countries that between themselves can't really take on a rising China one on one, but in a larger group, in a larger coalition, they find themselves more capable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that's striking is, the gaps between the scores for various countries. I think the one that was most striking to me when I initially looked at the report was the gap between China and Japan, right? I mean, the Chinese are at 75, over 75, the Japanese are at 42. That's a huge drop off. And so that just sort of kind of stands out to you visually when you look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other one, which some Philippine commentators were noticing, was the fact that the differential between the Philippines and North Korea is just a score of 1. I mean, the North Koreans are at 11.4, the Philippines are at 12.4. But again, it does go back to the point, what you emphasize, because if you look at the North Koreans and you look at the individual measures and components, it's basically just, the fact that they have military capabilities that are quite advanced, and everything else is basically almost flatlining.
Right, right.
So it really does, the index really does strikingly demonstrate the various components of power and how they can be very radically different for certain countries over others.
Yeah, that's actually a really fascinating point, the North Korea-Philippines comparison. North Korea is a very good example of a country that has put everything in one basket, right? It has huge conventional forces, over a million, can be called to the battlefield in the event of a war on the Korean Peninsula. They have nuclear capabilities, and they sustain a massively expensive, a military. In the meantime, the Philippines generally across the index, it's not an outstanding performer along any single axis of power, but effectively it's quite balanced. It's doing moderately well across. It certainly stands out as a middle power. But really, that kind of comparison, I think, really shows the importance of this holistic measure. So I guess the message for the Philippines isn't that, the 12.4 score is something to be ashamed of. I mean, especially given the ranking next to North Korea, but that, yeah, I mean, the Philippines' military capabilities, for example, are, it definitely punches far below its weight, especially when you look at, the security challenges it faces, the size of its population. It's really, that's really an area where Manila could make more investments. That's something, you and I talk about a lot when it comes to issues like the South China Sea and terrorism in Southeast Asia. Just the Philippines' absolute need to invest more in its military capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to mention, I think at the launch event, this was touched on as well, right? The fact that, I mean, this is kind of an initial project. It's taken a few years to come into fruition, but this initial iteration of the index is covering 25 countries. But there is a potential to, potentially, depending on how they cut it and choose to move forward, there is a potential to expand this beyond the current countries that are there, even though there's quite a representative sample of countries. I think we have a ranking that goes from superpowers to major powers to middle powers to minor powers. But it did strike me as interesting that the categorization for middle powers comprised many countries in the index, and there was a lot of variation in that category. Whereas for superpowers and major powers, it's just two countries each, right? So one of the interesting things that you can think about is, as we get to 2030 or out further, I mean, will we actually get some of these middle powers graduating to a class of major powers, and will we see some differences or shifts in that capability, or will the scores just kind of change over time? I mean, that's kind of an interesting sort of thing to think about, given the fact that there is that sort of imbalance in how these categories are being weighted.
No, I mean, like thinking forward to 2050. It broadly seems like these rankings, will tend to hold, with the exception of, countries like Japan,
Right.
maybe even South Korea, which will also see its own demographic decline. And then, I mean, we have the potential of, like we don't know what's going to happen with this Trump-Kim summit. Maybe North Korea does decide to pursue a Vietnam-style economic modernization project. What does that do to North Korea's power ranking if it retains its nuclear weapons by 2050? That's an interesting question to ponder. But certainly, I think this is really useful in terms of how we think about the future of Asian geopolitics broadly. It really helps to kind of see all of these categories side by side. So for listeners, I mean, I really do recommend kind of going to the website and playing around with these tools. Even if you disagree vociferously with how they've chosen to rank your country, you can, like Prashant said, play around with the numbers and see, how things can change. For example, what if the Philippines had nuclear weapons? So, that's always a good way to experiment with this tool. So Prashant, I think we'll leave it there for today.
Sounds good.
All right, listeners, thank you for tuning in as always. We'll be back next week with more. Both Prashant and I have taken an interest in the historic Malaysian election results, so I think that'll be our next topic of discussion early next week. So I hope you'll join us to take stock of that election. So thanks for listening. If you haven't left us a review on iTunes, please do so. And also make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.